There's a mistake in history that destroyed the Soviet Union in 900 days. 3 economic errors, cascading into collapse, military spending drowning productive capacity, monetary expansion creating ghost money, central planning suffocating price signals. The USSR made these mistakes from 1985 to 1991 and ceased to exist. And right now, in January 2026, the United States is repeating every single one of them, not similar mistakes. The exact same mistakes. Same sequence, same structure, same mathematical inevitability. Let me show you the 3 mistakes the Soviets made, how they triggered total collapse, and why the US is on stage 2 of 3 right now with accelerating momentum toward the same endpoint. In 1985, the Soviet Union was a superpower. Nuclear arsenal, global military reach, the second largest economy on Earth. 16 years of resource-heavy growth through the 1970s, fueled by oil exports and heavy industry. The system looked stable, permanent. And then 3 economic decisions, made between 1985 and 1991, collapsed the entire structure. Not gradually, catastrophically. 900 days from crisis to dissolution. Mistake number 1 was military overextension funded by resource misallocation. The USSR spent 15 to 20% of GDP on defense. That's triple what the United States spent during the same period. But the Soviet economy was a fraction of the size. They were matching American military capacity, tanks, missiles, submarines, troops, on an economy that produced a third of the output. To do this, the Soviet system funneled resources into heavy industry and defense manufacturing. Steel, oil, weapons, military infrastructure, these sectors consumed capital, labor, materials, but they produced nothing that improved civilian life, nothing that generated export revenue, nothing that fed the population. By 1980, Soviet agriculture was collapsing. They couldn't grow enough grain to feed their own people. A country with some of the best farmland on earth was importing grain from the West, from the United States, from Canada. Why? Because all the productive resources, the labor, the technology, the investment, were allocated to military production. Farms were neglected, mechanization lagged, workers were pulled into factories building tanks instead of combines. The misallocation was structural. It wasn't a temporary imbalance, it was the system's design. Defense first, heavy industry second, consumer goods never. Here's the mechanism of collapse. When you allocate resources to non-productive sectors, GDP growth stops. The Soviet economy stopped growing in the 1970s. By 1980, official growth was 2%. Real growth was probably 0. By 1985, contraction. And when growth stops but military spending continues, you have only 2 options: cut the military or print money. The Soviets chose option 2. Mistake number 2 was monetary expansion without productivity growth. The Soviet Union didn't have an independent monetary policy in the normal sense. They had a state bank, Gosplan, that created rubles on demand to finance government deficits. If the military needed funding, Gosplan printed money. If state enterprises needed credit, Gosplan printed money. If wages had to be raised to keep workers from rioting, Gosplan printed money. From 1965 to 1989, the Soviet money supply expanded continuously. By 1980, it was growing at 6% annually. By 1985, 10%. By 1989, over 15%. And the entire expansion was backed by nothing. Soviet production wasn't growing. Consumer goods output was stagnant. Industrial output was stagnant. Agricultural output was declining. So every new ruble created represented pure monetary overhang. Money with no corresponding goods to buy. In a normal economy, this causes inflation. Prices rise until money supply matches output. But the Soviet Union didn't allow prices to rise. They used price controls. Bread, milk, meat, fuel, everything had a fixed price set by the government. So the money overhang didn't show up as inflation. It showed up as shortages. By 1985, you couldn't buy anything in Soviet stores. Shelves were empty, not because there was no production, because there was too much money chasing too few goods, and the government refused to let prices adjust. The workers had rubles. They just couldn't spend them. Savings accounts filled up. People hoarded cash. The black market exploded, and the official economy seized up. By 1990, over 1,000 basic consumer goods were unavailable. Rationing became standard. Queuing for food became the national pastime. Estimates put it at 30 to 40 million person-hours per year, spent standing in lines. And still, Gosplan kept printing. In 1988, the Soviet government tried to fix this with the law on state enterprises. The law allowed factory managers to raise wages to attract workers in the tight labor market. Wages increased 25%. Productivity increased 4%. The gap between wage growth and output growth exploded. More money, same goods, more shortages. By 1989, official inflation was 2%. Real inflation was 8%. By 1990, official inflation was 5.3%. Real inflation was 20%. By 1991, official inflation was 96%. Real inflation was 200%. The monetary system collapsed. Mistake number 3 was central planning inefficiency. In the absence of price signals, the Soviet economy was organized by Gosplan, the central planning agency. Every 5 years, Gosplan produced a plan. Steel output, grain production, factory construction, everything allocated by bureaucrats in Moscow. The theory was that central coordination would eliminate waste and maximize efficiency. The reality was the opposite. Without market prices, planners had no information. They didn't know what consumers wanted. They didn't know what resources were scarce. They didn't know which industries were productive, so they set arbitrary targets. Factories met the targets by gaming the system. If the target was tons of steel, they produced heavy, low-quality steel. If the target was number of units, they produced small, cheap units. Quality didn't matter. Consumer demand didn't matter. Only hitting the target mattered. This created massive inefficiency. Resources were allocated to sectors that produced nothing useful. Factories ran at a loss, but kept operating because the plan required it. Innovation stopped because there was no incentive. Why improve a process when your salary is fixed and your quota is set? By the 1980s, the Soviet economy was riddled with corruption and stagnation. Managers falsified reports to show targets were met. Workers pretended to work because, as the joke went, they pretend to pay us, we pretend to work. Brezhnev's era, from 1964 to 1982, became known as the era of stagnation. Growth fell inexorably from 6% in the 1950s to 0 in the 1980s. Productivity collapsed. The Soviet Union was producing more steel, more oil, more cement than any country in the world. But the standard of living was falling. When Gorbachev became General Secretary in 1985, he tried to reform. Perestroika, restructuring, glasnost, openness. He decentralized decision-making, allowed some market mechanisms, tried to introduce price flexibility, and it accelerated the collapse. Why? Because the system was held together by central control. When you remove control without building market institutions, you get chaos. Enterprises raised wages without increasing output. Republics pursued economic autarky. Barter replaced currency. The economy fragmented into dozens of mini-economies. By 1991, the government couldn't intervene. Ministries were gutted. Officials were overwhelmed. Moscow lost control. And on December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. 3 mistakes. Military overextension funded by resource misallocation. Monetary expansion without productivity growth. Central planning rigidity without price signals. And the result was total collapse in 900 days, from Gorbachev's failed reforms in 1989 to dissolution in 1991. Now let me show you how the United States is repeating the exact same pattern. Mistake 1. Military overextension funded by resource misallocation. The U.S. operates approximately 750 military bases in over 80 countries. That's 3 times more overseas bases than all other countries combined. The cost to maintain this global presence is $66 to $80 billion per year just for the bases, not including operations, not including personnel, just maintaining the infrastructure. Total U.S. defense spending for fiscal year 2026 is $800 to $92.6 billion in base budget, plus an additional $150 billion supplemental. Total over $1 trillion. That's more than the next 10 countries combined. And just like the Soviets, we're stretched thin. We have commitments in Europe through NATO, commitments in Asia defending Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, commitments in the Middle East, countering China, countering Russia. If multiple fronts open simultaneously, China invades Taiwan, Russia moves on NATO territory, Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz, we cannot respond to all of it. The CBO project's defense costs will rise from $866 billion in 2029 to $965 billion in 2039, an 11% real increase. And this is during a period when the economy is slowing, when deficits are exploding, when interest payments are consuming the budget. Here's where the resource misallocation becomes visible. U.S. manufacturing has been in decline for 2 decades. Manufacturing employment dropped by 5.8 million workers from 1999 to 2011 during the China shock. In 2025, manufacturing lost 54,000 more jobs. Production is up 1.6%, but still below 2023 levels. Factory construction spending peaked in 2024 and fell for 7 straight months through August 2025. We import $800 billion more than we export annually. We are dependent on foreign supply chains for everything: medicine, electronics, steel, even military components. Just like the Soviet Union allocated resources to defense and heavy industry while agriculture collapsed, the U.S. allocates resources to military and finance while manufacturing collapses. We can build aircraft carriers, but we can't build semiconductors domestically. We can deploy troops to 150 countries, but we can't produce enough steel for domestic consumption. The resource misallocation is structural. Defense spending grows, productive capacity shrinks, and the gap is filled by imports paid for with borrowed money. Mistake 2. Monetary expansion without productivity growth. Since 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window, the dollar has been pure fiat currency. Since 2000, the U.S. money supply has increased 400%. Since 2020, we've printed over $6 trillion. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet exploded from $4 trillion in 2019 to $9 trillion in 2022. And what backs this money? Nothing. Not gold, not production, nothing but the promise that taxpayers will service the debt forever. Here's the Soviet parallel. The Federal Reserve creates money by purchasing government bonds. When the government issues a bond, the Fed buys it with newly created money, the government spends the money, and the debt goes on the Fed's balance sheet backed by nothing but future tax revenue. This is identical to Gosbank printing rubles to finance Soviet deficits. Same mechanism, different name. And just like the Soviet Union, the monetary expansion is running ahead of productivity. U.S. productivity growth has been declining for decades. In the 1950s and 60s, productivity grew at 2.5 to 3% annually. By the 2000s, 1.5%. By 2020, under 1%. The Congressional Budget Office projects that through 2035, roughly 4/5 of GDP growth will come from productivity increases. But if productivity is growing at 1% and the money supply is growing at 10%, you have a 9% gap. That gap shows up as inflation or asset bubbles or both. We saw this in 2021 and 2022. Inflation spiked to 9%, the highest in 40 years. The Fed responded by raising interest rates from near 0 to 5.5%. That brought inflation down to 3% by 2025, but it stuck. The CPI in January 2025 was 3%. In November 2025, still 3%. The Fed has cut rates twice, from 5.5% down to 3.5%, but inflation isn't falling further. Why? Because the underlying monetary overhang hasn't been cleared. There's still more money than production. And here's where it gets worse. The federal government is running $1.8 trillion deficits during economic expansion. The deficit in fiscal year 2025 was $1.8 trillion, 5.9% of GDP. The deficit is projected to hit $2.7 trillion by 2035. The debt is $38 trillion on 123% of GDP. Interest payments are $1.22 trillion per year. That's more than defense spending, more than Medicare, and it's accelerating. Every year, the government borrows more to pay interest on previous borrowing. This is the debt spiral the Soviets hit in the 1980s. You cannot stop borrowing because stopping means default. You cannot pay it off because paying it off would collapse the money supply. You can only keep rolling it over and keep paying interest. And the interest consumes more of the budget every year until the system breaks. Mistake 3, central planning inefficiency and lack of price signals. The U.S. doesn't have Gosplan. We have markets. But we also have massive government intervention in resource allocation, and that intervention is distorting price signals, just like Soviet planning did. Here's how. The 2025 One Big Beautiful Bill Act, passed in May, extended the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanently and added new tax cuts and spending increases. Total cost, $3.4 trillion over 10 years. At the same time, the Trump administration imposed tariffs averaging 15% on imports, expected to generate $2.5 trillion in revenue over 10 years. This creates a contradiction. The tax cuts are designed to boost demand. The tariffs are designed to constrain supply. You're stimulating consumption while restricting production. The result is inflation without growth. The CBO estimates that tariffs will raise prices, erode purchasing power, and reduce GDP by 0.6% to 6% depending on the model. And because tariffs are paid by importers and passed to consumers, they act as a regressive tax. They hit low-income households hardest while doing nothing to rebuild domestic production. Why? Because you cannot rebuild manufacturing with tariffs alone. Manufacturing requires capital investment, skilled labor, supply chains, and time. It takes years to build a factory, train workers, establish logistics. Tariffs don't create any of this. They just raise prices. If you wanted to rebuild domestic manufacturing, you would need to allocate resources, subsidize factories, train workers, invest in infrastructure. But the U.S. government is doing the opposite, cutting education spending by $233 billion in FY 2025, cutting clean energy investments, reducing EPA funding by 81%. These are the sectors that build productive capacity, and they're being gutted while military spending grows. The second layer of central planning inefficiency is industrial policy. The U.S. is now using targeted subsidies to reshape specific sectors. The CHIPS Act allocated $52 billion to semiconductor manufacturing. The Inflation Reduction Act allocated hundreds of billions to clean energy. These are attempts at industrial policy, government-directed resource allocation. And they're failing for the same reason Soviet planning failed. Bureaucrats in Washington don't have better information than markets. They don't know which companies will succeed, which technologies will work, which sectors will be productive. So they allocate based on politics, lobbying, and guesswork. And just like Soviet factories that met quotas by producing junk, U.S. companies take subsidies and produce whatever qualifies for the funding. Not what's needed, what's subsidized. Construction spending by manufacturers fell for 7 straight months through August 2025, despite the subsidies, because the subsidies aren't aligned with actual market demand. You cannot centrally plan an economy and expect efficiency. It doesn't work. It didn't work for the Soviets, and it won't work for us. The third layer is the absence of price signals in the most critical market, the bond market. The Federal Reserve is the guaranteed buyer of government debt. This means the government never faces a real borrowing constraint. Private markets would impose discipline. If the government borrowed too much, bond yields would spike, borrowing costs would rise, the government would be forced to cut spending. But the Fed prevents this by buying bonds whenever the market hesitates. This is financial repression. It keeps interest rates artificially low, allows unlimited borrowing, and transfers the cost to savers and future generations. Just like Soviet price controls prevented inflation from clearing the monetary overhang, Fed intervention prevents the bond market from clearing the debt overhang. And the result will be the same. The system will appear stable until it suddenly isn't. The Soviet Union looked stable in 1988. By 1991, it didn't exist. Let me show you the timeline. The USSR hit a peak debt and monetary expansion in 1985. Gorbachev tried reforms in 1985 and 87. The reforms failed and accelerated decline in 1988 to 89. Crisis hit in 1990. Collapse in 1991. 6 years from peak to dissolution. The U.S. hit peak debt expansion in 2020 with $6 trillion in COVID spending. We're now in 2025, 5 years later. The economic contradictions are building. Tariffs and tax cuts pulling in opposite directions. Monetary tightening with fiscal expansion. Military overextension with productive decline. The system is under stress. And the next crisis, whether it's a recession, a financial shock, a geopolitical event, will be the trigger. Here's what the collapse sequence looks like. Stage 1 is loss of confidence. Allies start hedging, trade partners seek alternatives, reserve currency status erodes. We're seeing early signs. BRICS nations developing payment alternatives. Central banks buying gold, China and Russia trading in yuan and rubles, Saudi Arabia accepting yuan for oil. These are cracks in dollar dominance. Stage 2 is currency crisis. When confidence breaks, dollars held overseas come flooding back home. There are trillions of dollars in foreign reserves, in trade accounts, and bond holdings. If foreign holders start selling, the dollar collapses, import prices spike, inflation explodes. The Fed would have 2 choices: defend the dollar by raising rates, which crashes the economy, or print money to buy bonds, which destroys the currency. Either path leads to crisis. Stage 3 is fiscal collapse. When the currency fails, when bond yields spike, when the government cannot borrow at sustainable rates, the only option is default, not official default. The U.S. will never formally default, but effective default through inflation. Print enough money to pay the debt in worthless dollars. This is what happened in the USSR in 1991. The ruble became worthless. Savings were wiped out. The government lost control. Stage 4 is political disintegration. When the economic system collapses, the political system follows. The USSR dissolved because republics stopped obeying Moscow. They pursued independence because the central government couldn't deliver economic stability. The same dynamic applies to any federal system. When the federal government cannot pay its obligations, states will seek autonomy. When currency fails, regions will create alternatives. When the center weakens, the periphery breaks away. I'm not predicting this will happen tomorrow. I'm showing you that the U.S. is following the exact same pattern that collapsed the Soviet Union. 3 mistakes. Military overextension funded by resource misallocation, check. Monetary expansion without productivity growth, check. Central planning inefficiency, distorting price signals, check. The USSR made these mistakes from 1980 to 1991 and collapsed. The US has been making them since 2000, accelerated them since 2020, and we're now deep into the sequence. The math doesn't lie. You cannot spend 15-20% of GDP on defense while manufacturing declines. You cannot expand the money supply by 400% while productivity grows at 1%. You cannot run $2 trillion deficits at 5.9% of GDP with $38 trillion in debt and $1.22 trillion in interest payments. You cannot centrally allocate resources through industrial policy and tariffs and expect efficiency. The Soviet Union tried all of this. They believed they were different. They believed their system was permanent. They believed the rules didn't apply to them. And they collapsed in 900 days. The United States believes the same things right now. We're the reserve currency. We're the indispensable nation. We have technology. We're too big to fail. These are the same delusions, and they won't save us from the mathematical reality. The pattern says collapse is coming, maybe 5 years, maybe 10, maybe less, but the sequence is locked in. Overextension, monetary expansion, planning rigidity. These are not fixable within the current system. They require structural reform, cut military spending, restore productive capacity, stop monetary expansion, remove central planning distortions. But none of this is politically possible. So the pattern will play out. If this showed you that we're not approaching Soviet mistakes, but repeating them exactly, stage by stage, subscribe, because when we hit the currency crisis and fiscal collapse, you'll want to understand what happened and why. The Soviets didn't see it coming until it was too late. We still have time to see it, but seeing it doesn't mean we can stop it. It just means we'll know why it happened. 3 mistakes, same sequence, same result. The USSR collapsed. The pattern says we're next. And here's my question for you. Do you think America can avoid the Soviet collapse, or are we too far into the pattern to turn back? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know if you see a way out or if you think the math is already locked in. If this video showed you something you hadn't seen before, hit the like button and subscribe, because we're going deeper into how empires collapse and why the signs are everywhere once you know what to look for. And if you want to understand the full pattern of imperial decline, click on the video appearing on your screen right now. There's a pattern in history that has destroyed 3 global superpowers. It shows you the complete 7-stage sequence and why the US has already finished 5 of them. Watch it next. You need to see how this ends.